Good morning. It's good to see y'all. We're going to be in the book of Esther this morning, so I'd ask you to open your Bibles to the book of Esther. So many things to learn from this book, and I think the example of Esther. We're going to take a more global look at it, though, in light of how God works through the life of Esther and Mordecai to preserve his people, what we might think of as the providence of God. A couple of weeks ago, in our lesson regarding the leading of the Holy Spirit, we read James chapter 4 together when we were thinking about the will of God and how the Bible makes a distinction between the revealed will of God, which we are to know and follow, and the unrevealed will of God, which we just can't know, but nevertheless we should be praying about. And that's one of the points that James makes in James chapter 4 when he says, you don't know what your life is going to be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a while and then is gone. Instead, you want to say, if the Lord wills, we will go to such and such a place and engage in business and make a profit, etc. Right? So James is speaking of the unrevealed will of God that we don't know, but nevertheless, we should humbly be praying to him about and asking for his permission, more or less. If this is your will, O Lord, let me succeed. Or as I noted in that lesson, sometimes men who lead prayers from this pulpit will say, defeat us where we are wrong. And that's a perfectly acceptable prayer. That's what we should be praying for. And I think the book of Esther is a good case study in answering some questions, to help us answer some questions that we might have about the unrevealed will of God and his providence, or what his plans are and how he's working. And so some of those questions that arise might just be, first of all, was there any evidence in the Bible that God works providentially? And what does that mean? We'll talk about that. And if God does work providentially, does he reveal his will in this way? So we also in that previous lesson talked about, should we be looking for signs in our lives that this is what God wants us to do, or he approves of our behavior, or does this mean we're justified before him if we're physically or materially blessed? And if he works providentially, how does that affect my choices that I make? And can I completely understand how providence works? So all these kinds of questions, I think, come to mind, and we'll talk about those and do our best to answer them from this book and others. So let's just begin by thinking about what is providence. When we say providence, it's not a word to my knowledge, I don't believe is mentioned anywhere in Scripture. It's a concept, like the triune God is a concept. We know God is in three persons. But providence is the activity of God as accomplished through natural laws, and it stands in contrast to the miraculous by which the Lord operates independent of law. That's a definition written by a fellow named Wayne Jackson. You'll find a different one in the dictionary as preservation, care, and government by which God exercises over all things that he has created in order that they may accomplish the ends for which they were created. So those are very wordy, right? But there's this distinction, God working through natural laws versus working miraculously. So as an example, think of Hannah. Hannah wanted a child, and we know Hannah in 1 Samuel was not able to have kids, but she prays to God, and Eli tells her that your prayer is going to be answered. And it is, and she goes and the text says that she then knew her husband in 1 Samuel 1, 19 and 20, and then she conceived, and she did have that little boy, Samuel. So by contrast, think of Mary now, Jesus' mother, right? She had never known a man, nevertheless she conceived and had Jesus. Well, that's the miraculous work of God. So both of those children, obviously gifts from God, but one God gave miraculously, the other God worked through his natural laws. Hannah knew her husband and they conceived together. So that's just an example between these two, this distinction that's being made when God working through the laws that he's created and versus operating independently of them. And so that is providence is the former, working through those natural laws. And there's lots of examples of this. I think there are other case studies. I mentioned Esther as a case study. Moses would be another one, right? Survive being thrown in the Nile. Well, he wasn't thrown. No, that's not fair. His mom put him in a basket, right? She was very careful. But still, there was a lot of risk involved in that and a lot of danger. But not only does he survive, but who finds him? The daughter of the king, no less, of the king of God's enemies, the enemies of his people who are trying to destroy them. And he is protected, Moses is protected, and he's raised in the royal house only to become the catalyst for their deliverance, right? That's not an accident. Joseph would be another example, right? He's sold into slavery. He's acquired by Potiphar, yet he prospers, and he's falsely accused in Potiphar's house. That leads him into prison, and then he's eventually called before Pharaoh, and then he becomes a royal advisor and delivers his family, right? And looking back on that in Genesis 50, Joseph says, and speaking to his brothers, he says, you intended this to be evil for me, but God intended it for good. God was working through all of those events and orchestrating them to bring about the deliverance of his people, right? So we can see that. And the same is true here in Esther. So let's talk about now what happens in the book of Esther. It's a fairly short book, 10 chapters. It'll take about 30 minutes to read. So we're going to do that now. Just kidding. We're going to do a summary of the book of Esther. But I encourage you, it doesn't take very long to read those 10 chapters to get a richer picture. So let's just go over the main events here. So this is during the time of exile. Remember, even though Cyrus's edict of the Persians said, okay, the Jews could go back in 538 BC, this is happening a little later than that when Xerxes, another Persian king, is on the throne. And Xerxes has this wife named Vashti. And when we begin reading the book of Esther, we see there's this disagreement between Xerxes and Vashti. So if you look down in verse 10 of chapter 1, it says, on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded that Mehuman and Biztha and Harbona and Bigtha and Abagtha and Zethar and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of the king, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. And so Vashti refuses to obey, and we're also introduced to this other individual named Mordecai, who happens to serve in the citadel, and he is also bringing up this young lady named Esther. He's her uncle. Her parents are gone. She has no mother or father. In chapter 2 and verse 7, you can see that the young lady was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So Mordecai, the servant, is also, again, servant to the king, but he has this niece that he's raising, Esther. So the queen refuses to obey the king, and he puts her out as a result. She loses her status as queen. And so this kickstarts a search for a replacement. And so out of all the women, and Esther happens to be one of those women who is taken and prepared and groomed to perhaps fill this role. And so the king favors her and decides to make her his queen. And in chapter 2 and verse 10, it says that Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai instructed her that she should not make them know. So now, big turn of events, right? Esther's the queen, Vashti's out of the picture. And as events move along, we're introduced to this other individual in the narrative named Haman, who we read about in chapter 4. Now, Haman is also a bigwig in this government. Viceroy is what I have him named there, but he has a lot of power. And he also takes great offense at this individual, Mordecai. They cross paths quite a bit, apparently. When Haman comes in, people bow down to him, but Mordecai does not. But before that happens, before we read about that in chapter 3, there's this brief instance where Mordecai overhears a plot against the king in verses 21 and 22. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's officials, those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Xerxes. But the plot became known to Mordecai, And then he told Queen Esther, and then Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name, right? So we think, okay, well, that has to happen for a reason, and that comes into play later. And so now we're talking about Haman. He's honored, but Mordecai does not participate whenever this happens. So if you flip forward to chapter 3 and look at verse 2, it says, all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. And the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why are you transgressing the king's command? Now it was when they had spoken daily to him, and he would not listen to them, and they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand. But he told him that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage, and he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So that escalated quickly, right? Haman takes offense at Mordecai, and yes, he wants to kill him, but not just Mordecai, everybody, all of his people, the Jewish people. So he gets this plot in the works, and because of this offense that he's taken at Mordecai as he plots revenge. Now, what does Mordecai do? He reveals this plot to Esther in the next chapter, chapter 4 and verse 1. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, he put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went out in the midst of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. And he went as far as the king's gate, for no one was there to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And so Esther finds out about this, and she wants to know what's going on. You look in verse 4. She sins and says what's going on, and she finds out, and she also writhes in anguish, it says there in verse 4. And all the king's servants, verse 11 of chapter 4, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man, woman who comes to the king to the inner court is not summoned, he has but one law. So Mordecai is convincing Esther, you need to do something about this, go talk to the king. But there's this law that's in the way, and that is if you show up and you have not been summoned, you could be put to death, unless the king holds out the golden scepter. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. And so Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you are in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. Verses 13 and 14, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether or not you have attained royalty for such a time as this. So that's one of those well-known verses within this book, right? So they see what's happening, they know this is going to be catastrophic, and they're in a position to do something about it, maybe, but they're not sure, right? But they have an opportunity here to do what's right. And Mordecai is saying, who knows if things have turned out the way they have just for this very thing that you could be the one to provide deliverance for God's people. You could be God's chosen instrument. Those aren't Mordecai's words exactly, but I believe that's what he's doing here. It's why he wouldn't bow to Haman. He was a faithful man. I don't think it had anything to do with pride. Verse 16, go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. This is what Esther is replying now to Mordecai. So we see in her character what? Faithfulness also. Right? Fasting is, why would you do that? You do it during a time of prayer. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast the same way, and thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. And then look at what she says. If I perish, I perish. So she's resigned herself to do this. And I think, again, it reveals her character. She's very brave. She knows the risk. She's well aware, but she's going to do it anyway. Right? She doesn't know what God's will is. Is she going to die when she does this, or is something else going to happen? And meanwhile, while that's happening, Haman wants to go and ask for Mordecai's life, and he specifically is building this special gallows to hang Mordecai on. But the night before he goes to do this, if you look in chapter 6 now, the night before this happens, Xerxes, he can't sleep. And so he says to one of his officials, let's read some history together. And so during the night, verse 1, the king could not sleep, chapter 6. And he gave an order to bring the book of records, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers. Remember those guys who wanted to kill the king? Mordecai finds out. He informs on them. And this is just so happens to be, of all the history, what the king is going to read about tonight before Haman comes and asks for Mordecai's life. Or right around the time. And he says, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for doing this? The king wants to know. And the king's servants who attended him said, nothing's been done for him. Right? All the while, again, Haman is thinking he's going to hang Mordecai on the gallows. Mordecai is ascending in the view of the king. And so Haman comes in the next day and says, Xerxes greets him and says, what should be done for an individual who I want to honor greatly? And Haman, goes on this big list about riding a certain animal and, wearing a special robe. And he says, okay, now go do that for Mordecai, is what the king tells him to do, right? You can't make that up, right? That's not a coincidence, right? Haman is being put in his place. He's forced now to honor Mordecai, this individual who has such disdain for, and that he's plotting to kill and all of his people. And Esther, we know, musters the courage to go and appeal to the king on behalf of her people. Now, she does this in kind of a roundabout way. She organizes some banquets, and she even invites Haman to these things. If you look in chapter 8, verses 4 through 6, it says that the queen Esther said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my petition, and my people as my request, for we have been sold. So Esther does go in, and there's this moment, and the king extends the scepter to her, and he allows her to come in, and she makes these banquets over the course of several days. And then finally, at the end of one of those banquets, she answers the king as to what her request is going to be. And this is when she divulges the whole plot, the whole story, the whole caboodle. That's the word I was looking for. And she says, O king, if it pleases you, let my life be given me as my petition and my people as my request. Verse 4, for we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed and to be killed and to be annihilated. And now if we have only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commensurate with annoyance to the king. And Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who would presume to do this? And Esther said, a foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman. So remember, Haman is there. He's been at all of these banquets. And then chapter 7, verse 6, Haman became terrified before the king and the queen. And so Haman is taken out of the picture, and he is hanged on the very gallows that he had built for Mordecai. If you look in verses 9 and 10 of chapter 7, behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king. The king said, hang him on it. And so they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. And then lo and behold, what happens to Mordecai? He takes Haman's position. He's elevated now by the king, just as Esther was. So not only are God's people saved and delivered, but they flourish. And that order that Haman was working out for a certain specific day, that all the Jews all over the territory of Persia would be wiped out, is reversed. And now God's people are allowed to execute their enemies. If you look in chapter 8 and verses 15 through 17, it says, then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a large crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. For the Jews there was light and gladness and joy and honor. In each and every province and in every city, wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday, and many among the peoples of the land became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. Complete turnaround, complete reversal of what men had planned to do to God's people. But notice, in all of that, God's name is never mentioned. He's never said to have a hand in any of that. But who can deny this being here in his Bible, that he is responsible for those events. Of course he is. He is able to accomplish his will in so many ways and turn what would have been a day of great sorrow into a day of great celebration and change the outcomes, the lives of Mordecai and Esther. So what can we learn? We went through all of that. Let's put it all together. Well, God is able to accomplish his will through natural law, and you think about, again, not a single miracle taking place that we read of in this record. All of these events are happening naturally, but it's amazing, it's unpredictable, and also scary at the same time that God has that sort of power to change events in these ways. I mean, nothing's going to get by him. Esther just so happened to be chosen as queen. Mordecai just so happened to be in the right place at the right time to discover that plot against the king. The night before Haman wants to ask for his life, the king just so happens to be unable to sleep and reading the history that specifically where Mordecai informed on those conspirators. Haman had to honor Mordecai, and Haman is thwarted and hung on the gallows. I mean, God can and does work in human affairs for the good of his people to accomplish his will. And he delivered Esther and Mordecai and all of those Jews in Persia, despite the opposition, despite big, powerful players making those decisions. No one can stand in his way. Now, the same is true for us. So let's think about some application. 1 Corinthians 10, chapter 13, the Bible says, "No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape so that you will be able to endure it." All right, so we wonder, okay, how could that all possibly unfold? I don't know. But I know it's true, and I know he's working so that I will never be tempted beyond what I'm able to bear by anything, whether the temptation comes externally or from something else that I'm exposed to. It will not be anything. God will not allow it to be anything that I am unable to resist. He knows my limits, he knows yours, and he knows the degree to which we should be tested and allowed to be tested. He controls that. He controls that. And I'm not saying that he tempts people to do evil. That's not what I'm saying. God can't be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone else. But he does allow us to be tested. So if we face sorrow for whatever reason, it's not anything that's ever going to overcome us to the point that we should throw up our hands and quit. Because he promises there's a way out. And he promises peace through prayer in Philippians 4, verses 6 through 7. Right? If we have guilt, there's a way out of that. He's promised forgiveness if we will come to him on his terms. Hebrews 7:25. He can save to the uttermost. And can we understand how God is working providentially? Again, I think the best that we can do, that's chapter 4, verse 14, that's the book of Esther. I didn't put the book name up there. Anyway, but that's where Mordecai says, who knows? Who knows if you've been placed in this position for such a time just as this? And it turns out that's how God chose to use these individuals to deliver his people. And again, Esther's words in verse 16, she obviously didn't know what was going to happen, but it turned out very favorably. Right? She says, if I die, then so be it. She could not have predicted the outcome, neither could Mordecai. And so I think one of the lessons we learn in that is that we shouldn't try to interpret life events to try and see if there's a message from God in those events. We can't understand what God is doing, who he might use, or under what circumstances he might use them, because providence is not an avenue by which he reveals his will. Right? You go back to James 4. The best we can do is say, if it's his will, then I pray that we will prosper, if he permits. And it's entirely out of our hands. We make plans, and we go to different places, and we maybe make a career change or something like this, and we do that prayerfully, and we do it tentatively, knowing and humbly that it is up to him. Right, that he may have something else in mind, and we're not expected to know that. We're just to do our very best and use what opportunities are before us to serve him. That's what Esther and Mordecai do. when confronted with this very difficult situation. We have to remember, too, that Satan is also working, and he is against us. And we think about the events specifically of this story. Mordecai had a whole lot of reasons where he could have rationalized and said, you know what, just to avoid the trouble and the consequences, I'll go ahead and bow to Haman. Right? But none of those reasons were legit, right? Did that mean that because Haman had been exalted to this position and was parading himself around, everybody was bowing to him, should Mordecai have interpreted that as, well, God must want me to bow to this individual also? Right? No, it didn't work that way. Esther also, she had some strong reasons not to approach the king uninvited, not the least of which is she could have been put to death. Should she have interpreted that possible outcome as, that means God doesn't want me to do it? No. And she didn't, right? She fasted and prayed and prepared, and she mustered her courage because she knew it was the right thing to do, and she goes. Other examples that I mentioned earlier, Joseph was sold as a slave and imprisoned. Did that mean God hated him? No, of course not. It had nothing to do with his fellowship with God. In fact, the text in Genesis says over and over again, God was with Joseph and caused everything he did to prosper. Right? So as soon as we start trying to interpret life events, we're going to run into trouble, and it's not our place. All we can do is say, along with Mordecai, who knows? God uses people in his providence in working through events, but he does not encroach upon our free will. And that's our last point here. God works through the choices that people make. It doesn't mean he makes those choices for them, right? He didn't make the choice for Pilate to give the go-ahead to crucify his son. He knew the choice that Pilate was going to make. If we read Acts chapter 2, Peter says that Jesus was delivered over and the Jews had crucified by the hands of wicked men according to the foreknowledge of God. God knew how that was going to play out. Nothing was going to take him by surprise. Just as he used Pharaoh to make an example of him, who in Exodus, who thought that he was so great and powerful. God put him in his place. He knew Pharaoh would harden his heart against him, and that's why the text reads as it does, that God hardened Pharaoh's heart by commanding him to let his people go. Pharaoh still had a choice. Esther still had a choice. So did Haman. We all have free will. If Esther had chosen not to act, by the way, remember what Mordecai said, deliverance is going to arise somewhere else. We know what God's will is for his people, in other words, that he was going to preserve them. This is in the time of the exile, so all the prophets, those prophecies of restoration had already been made, right? And to a large degree, the Jews had been restored to their land in Cyrus's time. And of course, those prophecies had a greater fulfillment in the coming of the Messiah and establishing his kingdom in the new covenant. And furthermore, in the new covenant, we have not been promised physical deliverance as God's people. I think that's a point that we need to emphasize here. Yes, there was physical deliverance for God's people in this time, but we've been promised spiritual deliverance, but only if we are willing. Revelation 22 in verse 17. The Spirit and the bride say, "Come," and to let the one who hears say, "Come," and the one who is thirsty, anyone who wishes to take of the water of life without cost. Right? So we still have a choice to make. And, I can look back over the events in the past of my life, as I'm sure you can too, and think of individuals who were led to you to teach you the truth, right? Just as Ananias was to Paul. And I know that's not an exact parallel, right, because God directly spoke to Ananias to do that. But we know that he's put it in that task in the hands of his people to teach others the truth. Right? And he made sure Philip was there in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 8 to teach that Ethiopian treasurer about Jesus. Right? And he's done that for each of us. He's exposed us to his truth somehow, through somebody, in some way. He worked that. All good things are from him. That certainly included. But the choice has always been ours to obey or reject him, to submit to his gospel or to walk away from it. And that remains true today. And even after the fact, if we have obeyed the gospel, and we should, the tests and the trials that come as a result of being a Christian, or just life in general, Peter says, we should interpret those as tests, as James teaches us as well in James chapter 1. He says, let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, again, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And so even those things, those trials, whatever they may be, God can use and does use for his people to what? Perfect them. To transform them. To what? Verse 4. To be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And there's so many passages that teach us this same principle. Listen to Job 23, verses 10 and 11. He knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I will come forth as gold. My feet have closely followed his steps. I have kept his way without turning aside. I don't know if Peter had that in mind when he was inspired to write 1 Peter chapter 1, wherein he speaks of our faith being tested by fire so that it can be proven in the way that gold is proven. But Job is making the same point, that it takes a lot of time and a lot of heat to extract and refine gold. And Job is picturing God as this master goldsmith who knows exactly how much fire or testing to apply for us, for our good and further refinement, so that we can prove ourselves through that fire, resolved to cling to his way and to his word, just as Esther did. David will say in Psalm 119, it was good for me that I was afflicted, that I may learn your statutes. In verse 71, it was good for me that I was afflicted. That's the perspective James is calling us to have. I don't know who said it, but they described experience as the most brutal of teachers, yet we learn so much. And I think that's true of the discipline and training we receive from God. It comes through the school of affliction. And so many of you are familiar with that school. And I think your brother Randy, he's not here this morning, who's had cancer twice and suffered a heart attack, among other things. And that's the school of affliction. And I'm convinced that he's learned to trust God more and value God's truth and promises even more through those things. Blessed is the one whom you discipline, O Lord, and whom you teach out of your law. We must yield to God in all things, including our affliction. I think that's another lesson we learn in the book of Esther. Her character mirrors, or I think is a foreshadowing of Jesus in so many ways, right? Because she, being royalty in such a privileged position, she didn't have to do what she did. She didn't have to stand in the breach and face death to deliver her people, but she was willing to do that, and she was spared. But the Son of God was not. He was willing to stand in the breach too and suffer a horrible death to deliver people, all those who would come to him and submit to his truth. And so here we find Christ in the book of Esther, again teaching us, submit to the Lord in all things, and you'll come to know him better. Ephesians 6 and verse 8, Paul says, whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord. Man, you see that principle in Esther so many times. God himself is willing to give us honor and dignity. He did for Mordecai, he did for Esther, and it's a picture of what he plans to do spiritually in the new covenant through his son. We know it is. Peter says in that same passage about our faith being proven in verse 7, he says, so that the proof of your faith being more precious than gold, which is perishable, even though tested by fire, notice he says, may be found to result in praise, in glory, in honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ, rather. He wants to honor us. He wants to elevate us too, with him in heaven. And he can take our love and our service to him and turn it into something far beyond our expectations, I think, just as he did with Esther. They didn't know what the outcome was going to be, but man, did it have far-reaching consequences. You don't have to be a queen for God to use you in that way. You know, over the past several months, we've been told time and time again that, you know, that there's so many limitations as a result of COVID or anything, or whatever else, and there's so many restrictions, and we just need to be careful. And there's so much risk involved. I mean, was there risk for Esther? Absolutely, there was. We're not talking about a disease, but holy smoke, her life was at stake, right? But still, that was not an excuse for her. She still had to yield. Death comes to us all. And I think Esther came to understand that. And she also came to understand what needs to be done must be done here and now before my time is up. Remember Jesus' words in Matthew 16:25, whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Whatever loses their life for me will find it. Yes, there are risks involved. There's risk every day you wake up and you just live your life. There's risk, right? And I can feel that tension too. You know, it's scary, and that's just the nature of this life, right? We're just never more than a step away from death. We don't know, right, James? You don't know what your life is going to be like tomorrow. It's not a guarantee. You're here for a minute, you're gone the next, just like that. And so do the work before it's over. And if you're willing to take the risk, let's just talk about that for a second. What's the risk? You could get sick, yes. You could potentially get sick with COVID. You could potentially die as a result. Okay? But if you're willing to take that risk to go to the grocery store, if you're willing to take that risk to go to work, or you're willing to take that risk to travel and see your family, but you're not willing to take the risk to assemble with God's people and worship him, what's wrong with that picture? We need to learn to number our days, and that begins with numbering this day. It's unrepeatable, but it's filled with opportunities to serve the Lord despite what's going on around us. It matters little what kind of work or service that translates to ahead of us, but what matters is that we do it for the Lord, and we do it with all of our heart, regardless of the risk, which, again, by the way, let me emphasize, will always, always be there. That's why we have the promise of heaven. We're looking beyond this life. Right? And I know it's easy to stand up here and talk about death in the abstract, but if we spend more time in the Word, it won't be in the abstract. It'll be personal to us. I think as it became for Esther over those period of days, however long she was fasting and reflecting and thinking about what needed to be done. My death, my life is at stake. Even so, your will be done, O Lord. That's the example that our Master left us to. So, let's be about his work. Thanks for your good attention this morning. Do you need to repent today? Do you need to put the Lord on in baptism? All things are ready for you to do that. We want to help you and pray with you, pray for you. Whatever your spiritual need is, please come as we stand and sing.